Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. Swamp people, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture. Throughout our show, we've talked about how migration has shifted and affected our populations and contributed to the development of the diaspora. However, we haven't fully explored the history of immigration policies and how they've impacted and even discriminated against us in the global north. The US has a history of discriminatory immigration policies that stem as far back as the late 1800s, when statutes from the 1875 Page Act to the Immigration Acts of the 1920s prioritized Northern and Western European migration and excluded others, primarily at the time Asian immigration. Here today to talk to us about immigration policy and its effect on migrants and migration from the Caribbean is budding legal scholar Joy Charles. Joy, thank you so much for joining us today and for being an avid Strictly Facts listener as well. Why don't we begin with you telling us a bit about yourself and how you developed this interest in Caribbean immigration policy?
Hi, Alexandria. Thank you so much for having me. Well, as you mentioned, my name is Joy Charles, and I am a law student. And my interest in immigration policy, in particular in the Caribbean, but overall in immigration law, is one that is very personal to me, being that my mother is an immigrant and seeing her process, her struggles, and her triumphs in the immigration system within the US motivated me to want to really tackle this huge problem that we have within our immigration system. Also, just my professional experience being able to assist children that had crossed the border and often having to overcome and experience very challenging situations in the process has only motivated me further to want to advocate for those who encounter the immigration system.
Beautifully said. We cannot wait for you to be done with law school.
Yes,
It's
me too.
necessary. Oh, I know. Trust me.
Yes.
Well, jumping right into our discussion today, I think it's important just before we get to, more present day issues to sort of lay that groundwork. So could you talk to us a bit about the sort of history of early Caribbean migration to the US and how these immigrants differed from their European counterparts?
Absolutely. So early Caribbean migration to the US, as you noted, was different to European migration in a few ways. Caribbean immigrants have voluntarily arrived to the US since approximately the 20th century. Many were more literate and skilled than their fellow citizens left behind, the European immigrants who entered the country at the same time, and the native born white population in the United States. This first wave of Caribbean migrants laid the groundwork for Afro-Caribbean life in New York City and elsewhere in the nation. It was often a intellectual and professional group of immigrants, and they often established a large number of businesses, ventures. They had a social political presence and also influenced artistry within New York City. So we see how this is the case with the Harlem Renaissance. We had political figures and leaders such as Marcus Garvey. We had Jamaican poet Claude McKay and Puerto Rican luminary Arturo Schomburg. So this wave was highly influential and contributed and has continued to contribute to New York City's Black immigration population throughout the years, making it one of the largest populations, numbering at about 1.1 million as of 2019.
I've had earlier episodes where I've talked about some of those figures, right? And how influential the Caribbean migrants were to the Harlem Renaissance in particular. But another really important facet when we're looking at this time period chronologically is the influence of the world wars, right? And so there's a bit of sort of like race debacle also. I mean, not a bit. This is 20th century US, right? History in a sense. But I think definitely the world wars had an impact on Caribbean migration to the States. So could you talk a bit about that sort of early bit of racial politics were happening at the time, and then how the world wars affected that shift in who was migrating to the US.
Yeah, for sure. So with the first wave, we have what's occurring at the time, known as World War I. And so with that, we had the Immigration Act of 1917 in place. And the first wave was pretty affected in that there was a lot of prohibition regarding the restriction of non-white immigrants from entering, but that did not necessarily prohibit the Black Caribbean immigration population that was already here in the first wave from growing, which it definitely did for about 30 years or so between 1900 and 1930, reaching 178,000. However, with World War II, we see that there is a seesaw effect taking place with Caribbean migrants having to decide whether they would leave their countries in order to come to the US or Britain, given that in the second wave, there's a reduction in size due to the Immigration Act of 1924, being that there's a favoring, let's say, towards Europeans. And also, we have the Great Depression and World War II. So it wouldn't be until after World War II where we see Caribbean immigrants being brought into the United States in order to work as migrant workers in Florida's sugar plantation. No irony there. But they would soon be dispersed to other states and sectors of the American economy. Um, but even with this, we see that the Immigration Act of 1952 would once again reduce the number of Caribbean workers entering and would virtually close the door to every other Black immigrant. So we see how this in turn causes Caribbean migrants to shift more towards Britain. And of course, Britain calls forth Caribbean immigrants in order to come and help repair their economies as well, because their economy is in shambles. And so they become a part of the Windrush generation.
Yet again, another episode we've briefly talked about. One thing that stuck out to me as you were talking is the fact that there's this, quote unquote, I obviously don't agree with this, right? But this is what the policies are saying when you analyze them. There's a desirability, for lack of better way of framing it, in who the US is, openly allowing to migrate or openly wanting to migrate to the US. And it's obviously, based on a racial standard. I think, even prior to that 1952 act, right? You're seeing a wave of, I think it was the earlier 1914 legislation that was particularly excluding Black and African descent individuals from entering the country. And I think that period to me is an important shift because I think oftentimes when we talk about like 20th century Black activism in the US, it often gets pitted as a very like Black American born, sort
Right.
of standard, whereas it's like there were Black people from other parts of the world in the US, and you see us really banding together in the Harlem Renaissance. You also see people like, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois coming to, sort of not the rescue, but the advocacy for, more open laws in terms of why are these immigration laws particularly harping on Black migration. And so I think, as it continues to evolve and as you left off on the 1952 Act, could you talk a bit about how race, continues to be a metric and how it changes during the mid 20th century, especially at a time where, the civil rights movement is really sort of in its heyday, as people often discuss?
Yeah. So we see that race continues to be a very defining factor throughout the 20th century, as you mentioned. But with that being said, we see that there's a reformation as a result of the advocacy, as a result of the political and social presence of Korean born advocates who are obviously seeking for the Black community as a whole to stand up for itself. So it would be through the reformation of immigration laws linked with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and eventually the implementation of the Immigration Act of 1965, that we see the changes that have been strongly vocalized for take place. And obviously not fully addressed, but begin to take shape and form as we see the third wave of Caribbean immigration take place. So with this wave, we have seen that it is the fastest growing group of all, given that with the Immigration Act of 1965, the kin preference system is in place. It is actively one of the groups that is shaping the racial and ethnic makeup of the United States, with more than half of Caribbean immigrants arriving prior to the year 2000, followed by 24% between 2000 and 2009, and 22% in 2010 or later. So we currently have about 21% of the overall Black population in the US represented by Black Caribbean immigrants and the US born children. And it's significant to note that the Caribbean diaspora is the largest source of Black immigrants in the US, with approximately 9 million inhabitants, Jamaica and Haiti being the top sending nations. And it contrasts a little bit to our African immigrants in that they're the fastest growing Black immigrant population, even though they are not the largest source. So I say that to say we recently saw some research come out by Migration Policy Institute and the Pew Research, where they found that approximately 46% of Black immigrants were born in the Caribbean, which is significant. And it's important to highlight that it is a group that is significantly influencing, changing, and transforming the Black population in the US. And it is one that needs to be highly paid attention to, because it will for sure influence the dynamics of our community.
I mean, even taking into account my own life experience, right?
Yes.
And the experience of our parents and grandparents, etc. Um, it's ironic because oftentimes, and maybe not oftentimes, but you don't necessarily always consider how the reverberations of certain policies affect us in very intricate ways that like are not like policy related, they're like more personal, right? As we're, sort of caught up into the more contemporary period, talk to us a little bit about just how migration is affecting people in their like independent, lives, right? I obviously think race being a very prominent issue here and how that plays out in the US because, in the US, unless maybe you have an accent or something, people are not looking at you and going, "Oh, you're Caribbean or you're from Haiti versus whatever else." Not that there should be a versus anything, but yeah.
Yeah, I think to definitely answer your question, obviously, as you were mentioning, race is the key determinant, or one of the key determinants that is often looked upon when we're looking at ourselves and seeking how we define others. So, of course, race is a constant that is defining Caribbean immigrants. And due to this, they are subjected to the same oppressions and structural racism that African Americans routinely face in daily life. Despite flawed narratives that we have seen in academia, such as Thomas Sowell's, that have sought to impose an ethnic hierarchy between Caribbeans and African Americans, we have scholars such as Suzanne Model, Mary C. Waters, Christina M. Greer, and Dr. Niambi Carter, who counter argue that there's a miseducation and obviously quote unquote fake news surrounding Black racial identities and how African Americans understand and interact with immigration in the US as a result. But I think that the attorney, Sherilyn Ifill, beautifully captures this when she emphasizes the point that when we are addressing Black migrants, and in particular, when we're looking at Black Caribbean immigrants, African Americans in this country should not necessarily get caught up in the quote unquote belonging trap, because as we see with the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, our citizenship as Black people has been a struggle since the infamous Dred Scott case. And in that case, we saw how the Supreme Court previously held that the Constitution did not mean to extend citizenship to people of African descent, regardless of whether they were enslaved or free. So we see how the same underlying tone of racism, injustice, and offensiveness overall in this decision had a strong impact with the way the nation would move forward politically and also the influence it would have in future cases.
There's even sort of like a racialization when you're thinking of how immigration gets talked about today, right? I mean, even growing up in Miami part of my life, right? And this is definitely like around the DACA generation. Um, Obviously, like Miami has a very large Cuban population, but I think that was very stark for me to think through how it just got pitted as sort of like this thing for Cubans, which obviously Cubans are from the Caribbean, but there was obviously like a racial, and sort of colorist aspect in sort of talking about that in a sense. And so I don't know, as I've just like been doing my own research and learning, but as the legal, that's why we got the legal scholar here today, joining us. What are just some of your takes on the challenges of these policies and, as they continue to affect our families and friends and neighbors, what are some of your major takeaways and what needs to be changed?
Well, a lot, to put it short. But given the research that's out there, and what I found to be quite surprising was that the US's immigration system saw its last major updates in 1990. So even before I was born, with the diversity visa program. Of course, we often hear about DACA and other more recent immigration programs in place, but there really hasn't been a major update since 1990. So this has been a point of contention due to the quickly changing and often uncertain landscape that is seen with immigration law and, of course, immigrant populations such as Black Caribbeans and Caribbeans as a whole. The Congressional Research Service, however, has found that Biden's administration priorities do include efforts to promote public health, economic recovery, the promotion of inclusive democracy throughout the Caribbean, also providing support to address Haiti's humanitarian, security, and political challenges, and just trying to engage with the region more broadly. But the issue there is that there is still a criteria in place for selecting immigrants that are allowed to enter the US. And it's proven to be misaligned with key factors that are shaping migration to the country and also the country's national interests. And so recently, the Urban Institute had a roundtable with Black immigration advocates and experts, and I highly recommend many to read it. I agree with a lot of the points made in that report, and it called for special attention to anti Black racism, which is something that we are facing in the race wars of today, um, highlighting the connections between immigration enforcement and the criminal justice systems, which honestly has not changed. And there hasn't really been much traction to see the transformations that have been advocated for. And also the acknowledgement of the historical context of exclusionary immigration policies. So, failing to pay attention to the nuances within immigration policy and the impacts that it has on immigrants of African descent, it really hinders the way American society, how the Black community truly will understand how racism operates in the US legal system. Not only obviously looking at the incarceration rate or at police brutality, but seeing that it's really all intertwined and how it even operates in many facets of immigration law. So it's very important that we have groups and issues such as those that are affecting Caribbean immigrants made visible, and that the structures and systems that are generating racialized outcomes be completely exposed as we dissect, analyze, and seek to have solutions to these issues and concerns.
Because there are so many, like, contradictions, right? When we look at some of these statistics, like, as I was doing my own research, like, seeing that Caribbean migrants tend to, like, be I think it's something along the lines of, like, Caribbean immigrants are more likely to be naturalized US citizens, right? But then on the other side, you have Black immigrants being, like, denied asylum at higher rates. So these
Yes.
contradictions, while, certain things have been beneficial in a sense, right? The overwhelming and overarching issue still comes back to how race is being valued, right? And, of course, we can't have a conversation like this without mentioning, our brothers and sisters at the US-Mexico border from Haiti,
Right.
right? Like, these are, again, an example of where we see Blackness as a prevailing issue, in terms of what is acceptable, quote unquote, migration. But then, if we look at the span of who's coming and who's allowed to come, it looks a lot different oftentimes.
Exactly. And to your point, because of the racialized history that we have here in the US, because race is often primary in ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation will often be categorized as second, thirds, and fourths. When we look at Black people, not necessarily trying to generalize here, but often due to the socialization that we have experienced in this nation, the concept of personhood is often not applicable. And when we're looking at the concept of personhood, which is defined as a placeholder for deeper concepts that ground our society's moral intuitions and human rights, Black people have not necessarily always been looked at as people, as persons, as individuals, as
As three-fifths of a person.
exactly. And we saw that written into our Constitution. So when we're looking at personhood, we have to realize that there are rights involved. And those rights are granted regardless of citizenship status, regardless of race, gender, identity, age. And going back to my earlier point with the 14th Amendment, yes, it does provide that all persons, right? It says all persons, and this is something that Sherlyn Eiffel drills home, that all persons are entitled to equality under this law. But that requirement is often bypassed, and essentially, certain immigrants are defined as non-persons based on differences between subordinate and dominant groups. So it reinforces a tiered system of personhood. And often, Black people are at the base of that.
Mhm. What are we gonna do?
I know, it's complex.
I know, but I think uplifting the fact that, as we have throughout this conversation, right, it's not just nation as an important aspect of migration and migration policies, it's really paying attention to the racial factor. And my hope, at least in, those listening and engaging with these issues, is that it's so much more than, thinking of what is quote unquote better for the country, or you know what I mean, to your point on personhood, right? Where do we draw the line? There's the difference between, like, people's survival and, just trying to, like, do something else, right? It's necessary in a sense for us to really take into account how the narrative shifts depending on the color of who's trying to come here. And then it gets more complicated when you add things like skills and age and sexual orientation, as you were saying. But
Right.
I mean, even when we think of discussions of Black Lives Matter, right? It's not just Black people who were born in the US.
Right.
It is.
A lot more diverse. Absolutely. It's a lot more diverse. We are not homogenous.
Mhm.
Obviously, as a Black people, we are a little bit of everything, right? So we can't necessarily seek to create barriers within or amongst ourselves. We rather have to look at ourselves as Black people as a united collective front, regardless of our political orientations or our beliefs and traditions. We honestly can overcome many things through a more united front and perspective. And I honestly think that by supporting our fellow immigrants that are coming from countries in the Caribbean, that are coming from African countries as well, we can join together and hopefully dismantle a lot of the inherent biases that are in place within our society and overall legal system.
Beautifully said. Beautiful note to almost end on, but I haven't asked my favorite question.
Of course.
My favorite question of all. There are different ways that we could take this, right? Because obviously nobody wants to necessarily like go read the immigration policy like
Right. It's
history type
very,
of
very
thing.
dense.
We don't necessarily want y'all reading
Right.
statutes of laws and things for
Of
this
course. Of course.
episode.
We'll leave
But
that for
what
me.
Right, right. It's in good hands though. That's all that
True.
matters.
Very true.
But what are nonetheless some of your favorite examples of how Caribbean migration history shows up in contemporary popular culture?
Okay. Honestly, I would say there are two shows that I have really admired. I'm going to add in one more, but it's not a show, it's more of like a documentary. The two shows are the classic show Desmond's, which pretty much demonstrates this Black Guyanese barber and his family living in Britain during early to late 80s and early 90s. And I really enjoy watching that show because you see how we have, as Black people, that diversity within our community, within our population. And so seeing it from across the other side of the pond, where we have African immigrants, Caribbean immigrants, and of course, Black Britons, represented in that show so beautifully. I love the way it's captured, the humor, the topics that are discussed, the experiences of that family literally reflect many of the things I went through personally and continue to see throughout our communities. The second show is Small Acts. I love that anthology.
Me
Both of the
too.
shows, yes, both of the shows are on Amazon. I recommend everyone to please watch it. And a third one, which even though it's not necessarily a part of pop culture, but has had influence amongst many documentarians and just those like myself who enjoy learning a little bit about history, and in particular Black history, is Black's Britannica. And that, I believe, was produced in 1978. And it highlights many of the issues that I discussed today. In particular, it focuses on Black Caribbeans that migrated to Britain and how their experiences were and still are shaped by the racism, bigotry, and overall exclusion. Unfortunately, it's still very relevant to date, but it's a great production and I highly recommend it.
Thank you so much, and definitely go check those out, y'all, if you haven't seen them already. I love Small Axe, so,
Yes.
but nonetheless, thank you all for listening. Thank you, Joy, so much for sharing all of your wisdom with us for this episode, and we hope you enjoy. Look more, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspodcast.com for more information from each episode. Follow us at Strictly Facts Pod on Instagram and Facebook, and at Strictly Facts PD on Twitter.